say that on the mic, but that's all right. Welcome to the School of Architecture's Spring Lecture Series. Tonight we are very happy to be able to welcome Krueck+Sexton and Tom Jacobs to UIC, who make up two of the three principals of Krueck+Sexton Architects. Before introducing Mark and Tom, I want to remind you of our last two evening lectures. This Thursday in second winter design theory from the GSB author Far from Equilibrium, and a week from today, the last lecture of the series is Ellen Manfredini from SciArt, Atelier Manfredini, Los Angeles. And then also, a happy note that we will have a reception after Mark and Tom's lecture, so upstairs, outside the main office, 3100 refrains. But don't go early. So a pleasure to have Mark and Tom with us. Krueck+Sexton received his B.Arch from IIT in 1980, the same year that he began working with Ron Krueck. And a decade later, the firm name was changed to Krueck+Sexton to recognize Mark's status as principal. A fellow of the AIA, Mark serves as a GSA peer professional and is a board member of the Lessner House Museum. Mark, a member of the CAF, Mark has also most recently been teaching design studios at Northwestern University. Tom Jacobs holds his diploma from the ETH in Zurich, and before rejoining Krueck+Sexton, served as a project designer at Krueck Demeron, primarily working on the new Young Museum in San Francisco. In 2012, Tom was awarded with the National AIA Young Architect Award, and he's been teaching at IIT as an adjunct associate professor since 2009. And it's this last fact that runs through the source subject, which is that Tom was among the first people that I hired at UIC, and he was the first to leave. Unlike others on his own accord, but we were very lucky to have him here for a year and glad to have him back tonight. During their 30-year history, from the Steel and Glass House in 1981 to the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies and beyond, Krueck+Sexton has received innumerable architectural awards for the subject of exhibitions and have been featured in many publications, including their monograph Work in Progress published by Monticelli in 1997. Their work spans all scales and types, from houses and apartments to federal office buildings and museums, furniture and interiors, to public art and master planning. Beyond this body of work, Krueck+Sexton has practically cornered the market on the exquisite restoration and renovation of projects by Mies van der Rohe, including Crown Hall at IIT, the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, 86880 Lakeshore Drive, and the Farnsworth House, among others. It's probably this close intimacy with the legacy and rigor of Mies's work, beginning with Ron's and Mark's education at IIT, that leads to the typical story of the firm as one that, thankfully, resisted or avoided the exuberant rebellion against modernism that began in Chicago in the 1970s, and it goes by the name postmodernism. In other words, Krueck+Sexton are often positioned as the dutiful followers of modernist legacy. But any cursory look at the projects, from the pleated curtain walls to the totally unorthodox way in which the project touches the ground like a transparent house, to the warping, shape and warping of the box at the 1100 First Street project, will suggest that this is an oversimplification of much more complex and subtle work. Of course, the anecdotal evidence of this flirtation with the dark side can be seen in the fact that Ron taught here in the late 80s and early 90s under Stanley Tigerman. But it can also be seen in the fact that Krueck+Sexton have maintained a boutique design practice and sensibility despite the increasing scale of their work, and are a rare alternative to the corporate professional practices that still dominate the city and which were always the real target of the Chicago 7 and others. For me, it's the productive 30-year misreading and swerve from Mies that most characterizes Krueck+Sexton's work and puts them as interesting instigators to much younger practices, some of those that we've had here at the school, such as KGDBS in Brussels last year. And I think this also reveals the kind of double agenda of tonight's invitation, either shocked that it was issued or shocked that it was given. Sort of the only Nixon can go to China motif, I suppose. But I would like to start a new kind of matchmaking between Krueck+Sexton and UIC. because it's about time that our graduates started banging down the doors of Krueck+Sexton and pleading for work. They are one of the very few firms today that practice the ideals and design rigor that we also hope to try to instill. So I hope you will all go to their offices and be met with a kind of amused enthusiasm by the department principals. So please join me in welcoming Mark and Tom.
Thank you, Bob, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'm Mark Sexton, my partner. Tom, you can imagine what it's like with Ron and I practicing for 30 years to allow another person into the fold. Tom, I always said, is the only Swiss person that I've ever met that has as good a sense of humor as my Irish ancestors. So he fits right in. And actually, humor is a very good element to have if you're an architect because it's better than crying. So what we wanted to do today is talk just at the beginning a little bit about our history and projects that we've worked on very quickly, and then dive into 3 projects. And we want to talk about what we call the art of making, because we think the tools and design that you develop and you start to get introduced here and develop is just one part of the process of designing a building. Actually, designing a building, a space, a piece of furniture, a rug is all the same process. And it's really, until it gets completed and you're touching it and feeling it and smelling it and tasting it, we don't think the design process ends. So we want to talk a little bit about that, not in a labored way, but hopefully a way that sort of reveals what our process is, which frankly, after 34 years, Ron and I and Tom are still trying to understand what it is, because a lot of times it's pretty much a mystery. Let's see here. Okay. Excuse me, this may be a little slow. We office in Chicago. We only have one office. There's 17 of us presently in this little building. I think we are very collaborative, like so many firms today. We're, again, because of the size and we don't divide projects between one person and another. We actually work on everything, which causes, again, some amount of turmoil. The first project, actually, I was introduced. I had very little to do with this project other than to work on the furniture, but it was actually the first project, which was a house. I think Ron was about 30, 31 years old when he did this, and it was really a great sort of graduate thesis project. So in 1978, 79, 80, when postmodernism was raging, all of a sudden this steel and glass house appeared, and it really, a lot of people saw it, and to this day, a lot of people remind me that when this appeared on the cover of Progressive Architecture, it was quite a story. So, but the idea of learning and sort of fulfilling the things that Ron had learned at IIT into a project was quite an accomplishment. Ultimately, it was a very lucky condition. We then, what that did is it put us a little bit on the map. So we had a chance to be invited to a showroom design. I think 6 or so architects were given $5,000 to do a showroom. Now that's $5,000. That's fee and all the materials for the showroom. So this is back in the early '80s, but still $5,000 wasn't a lot. This is for Thelme, so we ended up doing this rather beautiful space, very abstract, with chairs dance through the space. Turns out that someone saw it, and in '83, someone wondered if they could live in it. We said, since we had no work, we convinced that yes, you could live in it, and this particular project happened. So our practice was really centered on some commercial work, but a fair amount of residential work, because residential work was a type of work that allowed for some experimentation. In this case, a duplex apartment in East Van der Rohe's famous 860 Lakeshore Drive building. Attention to detail and connections, composition, and light are and continue to be sort of the center points and principles of how we look at projects.
So in 1998 is effectively when I joined the firm, and this project, the Herb Miller showroom in Chicago, was the first one I happened to work on. And you know, Herb Miller, the great furniture company. The question was, what kind of showroom should one build in honoring some of their great furniture? And this actually also coincidentally, the interesting thing is with joining Ron and Mark at the time, I come out of Switzerland out of 18 and there's like, you know, all the talk is about birds I've never already, and Zoom Thor, and for instance, the whole idea of shingling just came out. That's what everybody did in Zurich at school, and so we sort of came upon this idea here, and the client loved it, Mark loved it, we built it. So also the idea of painting the showroom with light instead of painting the walls, so you can see some ideas. And in consecutive years, there's basically also a ceiling developed that is very open. Actually, one of our first real dealings with the computer and actually computer manufacturing components. So taking full advantage of CAD. And at the same time, then this is a factory in Wisconsin that basically had this amazing owner who said, you know, we're making these plastic parts, but I want to create a facility that makes the workers really happy and all the people that work there. So the idea of creating a workplace that's basically a glass box and that allows connections from the workers to the people in the administration, but also to the outside. And so they call this the walk of democracy, because the workers on the left can sort of see where the administration people would work. And just a very forward-looking client that ultimately allows this type of architecture to happen. Actually, just really quick, this also, you know, sort of this has become sort of something we always refer to. Typically, niche, when you have a modular niche, it means a modular piece. So here we got into 3 different, you know, steps, which still causes consternation in our office once in a while. In 2004, we added on to the Halo building that was run by Helen Young in the background, so Shure microphones, all this building. They needed a technical center addition to the back. And here again, as you can tell by now, we've always been very interested in the use of glass and sort of seeing how can you push it and what can you get out of it. So from the outside, including almost all the inside walls, with the exception of some super graphics, test labs, you know, the use of glass fairly extensively. Then Hubbard Street Dance, actually not too far from here, a very much of this part, about $900,000 to basically reposition Hubbard Street, this great institution, giving them a new look and presence on the street. And so the perforated metal and some graphics. So again, just off the street. And once in a while, as you see, the first house was a residential project. This is the last one that we've done actually in Florida, for a person who was due to a childhood sickness, he was constrained to basically spending his childhood indoors. And so he had this dream of living out in the sunlight and really having maximum amount of exposure to daylight. And so on this rather spectacular site in Florida, he sort of built his dream. And this project, in terms of, you know, my opinion, when you sort of think of Ron and Mark's work for all these years, I mean, this is unbelievable because it's pretty big, but it's like the whole house is like a piece of furniture. Because every inch is dealt with in detail just like that. And he also happened to be an art collector, so you get a sense of some of the works he bought. Also in 2008, we were in the middle of the Chicago Children's Museum expansion plans in just on Grant Park. So those were some of the renderings. How do you put a building in the park without using any land? That was a bit of a controversy back at the time, but it's actually very interesting for us. And also, in a similar time frame in 2009, we were one of the 4 shortlisted firms for the Eisenhower Memorial. in Washington, D.C. So this was sort of dealing with a personality like him and trying to figure out what does it mean. The short answer is basically that we said it's almost like a civic porch. So you take this idea of this childhood home where he and his family, this great photography where he and his family spending lots of time. And we sort of suggested that as a solution for the memorial, which was then won by Frank Gehry, and is not completely stuck. Congress has pulled funding, and the future of this project is completely unknown.
So what we'll do is talk about 3 projects in greater detail, and each one of them is an interesting journey for us. The first one, as so many of you have seen, is the Crown Fountain, which is a sort of a great project. This is what beautiful Grant Park looked like in 1930. You can see that presently Millennium Park is where all the railroad tracks come together, just north of the Art Institute. I don't think, what's interesting about this particular image we got from Ed Bueller, I don't think there's one tree in Grant Park. So it's got the Buckingham Fountain, and that's it. And this was a little 1998, just a big hole in the ground for people who've been in Chicago. This was it's a forgotten memory actually, but that's actually what it really looked like. And then of course Millennium Park. So before all of this happened and became realized, we were tasked with, we were approached to work with an artist to realize his fountain. And Ron and I, we said, we really don't do other people's work. We thought this was a violation because we were design architects, and why would we do it? And then we started talking with, in this case, the developer who was in charge of it, and we realized very quickly that anyone who knew anything about water, video, and glass block would never put it together like this. So we were actually very intrigued, and we actually loved it. And you have to understand, you've all probably seen it, but at this time it was just a drawing and sort of this idea. We said, it's so kooky and so unbelievable that it probably won't get built. So yes, let's start working on it. Whether we rationalized it or not, we said, well, it's just like they have no idea actually how to put it together. So like a client who says, they want a building of X size and it has so many things. They had the ingredients, but not the ability to actually pull it together. So we started working on it, but very fearful of the artist, Jean-Marie, because we figured, well, only a egomaniac artist would do something like this. So it's going to be a stormy relationship. And I showed this image because in some ways it looks really simple, the fountains, the plaza and what have you. And it's simple like ballet looks simple. It's supposed to look simple. It's supposed to be light and airy and have just a great ease about it. But again, anyone who's ever tried to do this in their living room, it's pretty hard to pull it off. So, so what I wanted to do is talk about sort of the process we went through. The thing about this is we actually came to the project without knowing anything about fountains. We had never done a fountain in our life, but we had this sense of material development that we've always been very interested in. And so the idea of developing materials in the assembly and working with the artist was a great challenge. Here actually is Jean-Marie behind our building, actually looking at glass blocks. So again, it wasn't something that you went to Home Depot or Corning Glass and ordered a bunch of glass blocks. We actually had to develop that product. And so in this case, this is actually a mold, so it's a cast iron mold, and the molten glass is actually placed in this mold. It's all done, the glass is actually put in through a series of drops by the glass manufacturer. So it took us several months to actually find even who was capable of doing this. We found a group outside of Pittsburgh, which is it's actually a epicenter of sort of Czech glassmaking in the United States around Pittsburgh. PPG was sort of headquartered there for a reason, because they had a lot of history and culture of glassmaking. In this case, it was sort of a boutique firm that did glassware. In this case, you can see, for us, Tom and I were very involved with this. You can see that the glass is actually ladled in. It's basically a ceramic ball where the glass is dropped into these molds. And the guy here with the scissors is actually the most skilled person in this lower left image. He's the guy who actually, as they're dropping the glass in, he snips the glass to 10 pounds, plus or minus about an ounce. So it's actually quite skilled. And he did that 22,000 times, so he got pretty good at it. These are the glass pieces coming off the piece. So what we would do is go there and work with them in the development of the block. The idea that the block had a particular dimension was very important, and I'll talk about that specifically in relationship to the LED. So we had the case of just what it looked like. We had no idea. So again, when it's done, it all looks like it's very understandable. When you're actually going through the project, it's a little bit of a black hole. We wanted to understand exactly what the image would look like through that glass block. So you can see here on 3 sides it is the left hand, which is obscure, and then on the 4th side, the LED side, it's clear. You can see the notion of the clarity of the water whiteness of the glass. This is 2-inch thick, so you can see it used no color into that photo behind. So that was a very important part of the process. Structure was something that was probably centered to developing once we had the block set. So it's actually a very simple structure, this idea, almost like a mini high-rise, about 50 feet. The large faces, again, are about 26 feet wide, 50 feet tall. The narrow faces are about 16 feet. So it's a fairly hefty area and had to be structured. So it was actually fairly easy to structure it this way. The real problem was how do you actually get what is, instead of a block, it's actually more of a tile. This shows the relationship of that structure in its place under the garage. So there was a 2-level garage here. You can see the load is actually taken and distributed on the floor and columns of the garage, and then the whole control system is below that. There's basically a water reserve of about 2 feet under the actual area of the fountain itself, and all the controls are there. So we had this idea after working on it for several months, this idea of how do you actually put it together. We had this great idea of basically taking the blocks and having made sort of linking them all together and then putting a compression ring around it. So this is sort of a diagram of that compression ring. And then on the compression ring there would be clips that we would then clip onto the panel. So we actually needed to mock it up, and this is where we really perfected the notion of mocking up. We actually made it out of wood because we couldn't get the glass quickly enough, but we had the wood. We actually put it in, you can see here, this is actually the compression ring. We decided to sort of make it like this. So there's the panel that we were making. We lifted it up, and Steve Crown, who was the patron for the fountain, we had him come in and he said, yes, we figured it out where other people couldn't, because there was another firm that worked 1.5 years on this project and couldn't get anywhere. So we were the second firm working on it. He said, we had figured it out, and you came in and we moved this panel, we put it vertically, we moved it about 1/4 of an inch, and the whole thing exploded. There were blocks all over the floor. And to say we had our tail between our legs is an understatement, and Steve Crown is such an incredible person. He said, well, I'm really glad it happened here rather than in the fountain. But for us, this was like a major breakthrough because it was the failure of this actually that helped us see the possibility of it. And we said, instead of relying on the blocks here, let's pretend they're not there. Let's look at it, let's turn it upside down and say, there are no blocks. We're no longer going to depend on the blocks for the structure. And that's what led us to this idea of creating basically a T-net condition. You can see here the gravity load is held by these T's. The block is simply put in to prevent the T's from twisting, but I'm no longer relying on the block itself. The whole structure happens. And it was that failure that you hear so many times, your parents and professors always tell you the failure is where you find the solution. Actually, in this case, it is true. So by eliminating that, so you can see here, the actual structure is this T. The T's on the inside. You can see it's mortised into the glass block, and just the silicone on the outside. Again, the block we're not dependent upon. This is a horizontal. You can see that's the structural T. It's sort of a web. We simply take those T's, glaze them, bring them onto the site, and assemble them. So you can see here we teamed with a group out of Florida. They actually made because of the dimensions being very accurate, they made a full-size jig actually to make the faces of the fountain. And you can see them glazing the pieces on the floor. So on the left side is the actual T grid, which is, again, it's basically once that glass gets in, it forms a beam, sort of a composite beam that can resist both the gravity and the lateral load. So, and the great thing, and it didn't dawn us initially, but we realized that when we had the block and we held it, you would never see our fingers because of internal refraction. You didn't see, so if you go to the fountain, try to find all that steel. There's an enormous amount of stainless steel in that wall. You don't see it because of how it all works. You can see the pieces actually coming together. And for us, this is actually a thrilling part of the project because we're actually into putting things together and sort of making it as simple as possible, and even something that we didn't have a clear idea of how it was going together initially. Once it's all done and it's hoisted in place, you can see here the straps, the blocks are left out just to hoist in place into the glaze. So very simply constructed. You can see the pieces. And then the other thing is that the blocks themselves, again, only 2 inches wide. We wanted to have no sort of structural heroics here. We didn't want the structure to be expressed. We actually wanted it to be just very simple and veil-like. So we did what we call these outriggers. They're about 2 feet away from the actual structure, and the idea is that takes the lateral load. So I just showed you how the vertical or gravity load is taken through all that stainless in the T assembly, and then this picks up the lateral load. Many fights took place over how many and where they were located, but it was an interesting. And then LED, this is on the side that has the LED, you have the same lateral loads, and so how do you support that lateral load when you have an LED wall? In our case, we kept trying to convince the LED manufacturer just to put a hole through his LED, and he kept telling us that would be $1 million in re-engineering costs because it's all a component, sort of putting a hole through your laptop computer a little hard. So we came up with this idea of just creating a little bit of a gap. And he assured us, the manufacturer was an expert at LED, that you wouldn't see that. And so you can see it going up here. We mocked it up again, the different types of LED behind our office. This is actually everyone together. That's Steve Crown in the tie, and then Jean Plensa looking at it and making sure, the actual visual of his piece. Turns out that we became great friends through this process. I mean, it was a great relationship. I mean, sort of working with him and realizing what was his design, it was his concept, which is, I think, magical beyond anyone's expectations, but actually trying to fulfill what his ideas were. So authorship of the fountain was never an issue. He was the author of the fountain. We were simply the translator of making it physical. But we think that's actually what architects do. They become the translator and make things, they make things physical. They create space. So in this case, there's the technology of the LED panels. You can see here, this is sort of a shootout between 2 manufacturers in our alley. And then, because we weren't sure at all how it was going to perform, we had no idea, we actually mocked it up in the park. So it's about 20 feet high. We've got some panels of glass, and then actually put it up. You can see the Pritzker Pavilion has no stainless on it. It's just the trusses for it. So we had the opportunity. And the great thing, again, working with someone like Steve Crown and the entire Crown family, they wanted to always do the right thing, so this idea of sort of mocking it up and saying, we don't know what to expect until we actually saw it was very important. And then we actually mocked up the entire screen in just outside of Salt Lake City. Part of the contract requirement was that you mock up the whole thing. And they said, yeah, come to our warehouse, you can see it on the floor. And we said, no, we won't accept seeing it on the floor. We have to see it vertically. They go, well, we can't do it vertically. I mean, you know what that is? I mean, we don't have a building. We said, we'll put it outside. They said, we can't put it outside. It's a huge sale. You know, why would we do that? And we said, well, we can't give you any more money until you do it. So it turns out the guys right next door to them, unbeknownst to them initially, was a roller coaster fabricator. And the guys next door to them, they said, could you guys help us do this? Well, the roller coaster cowboys, they said, no problem. They had this up in a day and a half. They had this, so you can actually see that's a roller coaster piece. Track, and they simply put the track on and put a bunch of guide wires. It was spectacular to go and see this. And you can see exactly the reason we did that, because see those gaps that you have there that we were assured was going to be a problem? You can imagine if that actually ended up happening. So we modified that gap design a bit and actually just made it tighter. But that's what this showed for the first time. And also for the first time for us, it was sort of the size of it, which was quite beautiful. The water feature, well, this of course is the sort of central part of the fountain. These are images that we were given initially by Jean Planza, this idea of what we call the gargoyle. But we know that water is, obviously magical and wonderful, but is also used to fight riots and quell civil disobedience. So we said, we have a real concern about this. This is a very public piece. How are we assured that that water feature is not going to be an issue? And so we did things like this. This was in October, so this is 12 years ago now. I said dead people. We could have like dead people on it. And then Steve Crown wrote, wouldn't it be great, over X million killed at the Crown Fountain. So we were in the sort of, this is again a project meeting, and this is what is so, I think, enjoyable about it. And then of course, Jean Planza gets in. If it happens, the thing on the left happens, then since I was the person who stamped the drawings and I was a licensed architect, I would be in jail. So, because he was just a Catalonian artist, nothing like that would ever happen to him. So we actually ended up working with a group out of Toronto and actually went into the pool to make sure, like personally go into the pool and make sure that it would not, not Aunt Millie over. It all seems very simple now, but when we were doing it, but this could be a major issue. We developed this this beautiful, basically shower head is what it is. It's glazed into the block. So next time you're there, it actually is a whole piece of polycarbonate that has these chambers that fill up and then squirt out. We actually had 2 shower heads made because we knew the city would lose one, and they in fact have. So we'll probably have to go back and have another one fabricated. And then we actually did a full-size mock-up. So we were concerned about how the water flowed off the top of it, and you can see it actually did. So we actually curved the block. Again, the insistence about the purity of the detail, the project manager said, no, just do that out of aluminum. It's a lot cheaper. We said, no, there's like this purity of concept that even the top edge needed to be curved, and the glass people agreed. So, and then finally, I think is the lighting. Rather than down lighting, we actually decided that it would be much more ephemeral if in fact we uplit it. So the lights are all above. So you can see here in the sequence, and I think many of you, this is actually how it was given to the Park District of Millennium Park. All finely tuned light fixtures. Unfortunately, giving this fountain to Millennium Park or the Park District is like giving a Ferrari to a 14-year-old teenager. They barely get the gas in it. In fact, the story is you're supposed to clean out the filters like twice a day. Check for it went months, and we still can't believe that there's not some public health crisis, because given how that fountain is used, it's amazing. So, and I just added these pictures of it, all of which you've seen and probably experienced. But I think for us, this was like a profound change because it showed in a really physical way what art and architecture can do, and the power of art and architecture, and the power of art and architecture to bring people together, to celebrate life, to celebrate the physical and to celebrate something that is an event, and it's very simple. So I think that's the thing that we really took away, and this became sort of a benchmark for us about how it would work, how a project could work, how even in a dormant period, winter in Chicago, how a fountain can still be alive, how it's framed by the sort of beautiful gilded frame of Chicago architecture, how it really is used to celebrate life and to celebrate an event. And I think this last image of the young boy, again, it became a profound sort of snapshot of how powerful our work can be. You know, when you do an office building, even a house, it's not quite as a single image as powerful as this. So we ended up using this as a benchmark for how we judged other projects. I think for us it was a chance to really think differently about how our work affects people through anyone that would experience it.
So our middle project, I'm going to talk a little bit about Spurs Institute. Just down the street from Crown Fountain, and this illustrates there was basically a gap in the street frontage of South Michigan Avenue, and this is what it looked like. They were actually just in the building to the left. This was the IBM building at some point, so the nondescript modernist. And we basically, the real question was, what do you do there? It's the year 2003 when we started. The whole South Michigan Avenue street wall had just recently been made into a landmark district. And so with that designation, there came about, this was paperwork where somebody went through and sort of set out the rules and said, here's what you want to do, so this fits in. And our, this is the first sketch. What we found out, we said we wanted it to be inviting, whatever that meant. But fundamentally, we thought it has to be contextual. I mean, if you have a street wall of that quality with a number of buildings by Sullivan and Albert and Ruth and so forth, there has to be a relationship to it. And so as we did some research and basic research and looking at the kinds of buildings that were there, we noticed how, when you go up closer, how rich these facades truly are. I mean, they sort of look like punched window openings at first glance, but at second, particularly if you look at something like the auditorium building, there's an incredible depth in the facade and a richness in expression, and also quite a few of these facades are actually sort of modulated in and out, basically bay windows that were used in series. And so that led to, we sort of thought that there has to be some of the spirit model probably fit in it. And here you see some of these close-up shots where this articulation, and why is the auditorium building a great building? And for us, it became clear is because the people at the time in Sullivan and his parties basically used the materials of his time to the greatest extent possible. And the way they articulated the stone, the colors they used, and achieved a real rich appearance. And so what you're seeing here is basically a series of models, and some of these, I think we should actually, maybe are interesting in this kind of setting, in an academic setting, in that, if this is not any different than what any of you go through when you develop a model. And this image in particular still holds the title ugliest model that our office has ever built. Because it's really, you never build anything like that. But there was one lesson or one key insight that we gained from this, which was that the width of the lot was only about 82 feet. And we sort of we knew it was going to be 10 stories plus minus, so you end up with this proportion. We knew that. And what this told us is that if you actually articulate, or if you sort of have this crease in the middle, you could stretch the proportion significantly. And so this is the takeaway of this. And in addition, this is something that both Ron and Mark have held dear when we talk about modernism. There's also a great interest in art in particular. And so, this cubist painting by Picasso is sort of actually probably a good example to show which even at the art fair, there was a time where all of a sudden people figured out, if I wanted to show a face, I could show it face on or in profile, but then here it's sort of, he does both. And so it's not black or white, but there's basically expressions of the same thing are layered over. And so this idea of layering has always been very important to the work we do. And that also influenced further and further studies. And some of this idea to really almost, crease it more and then fold the glass more. So you just see how these studies go. And then this was actually fairly close to the form that was ultimately built, still here in cardboard. Then when you send somebody out to buy some sheet metal at the hardware store, and all of a sudden you could tell the difference in when you actually pick up some of the reflection and how much richer it gets. You can tell what probably might happen with it. So back then there was basically between the last light and this, I think there were 2 weeks, and there was a key moment where the old Mayor Daley had been sort of kept abreast of the development, but at some point he made a decision and said, I'm going to see it, tell you what you're building. And so within 2 weeks we basically had to settle down on something, and that's what produced this rendering. It was ultimately shown to him. And the amazing thing here is that going back to these stacks of paper about what would be the right thing to build, which had a lot of references to, it was much more traditional. And at some point we said, look, it has to be of the future too. It has to be forward-looking. We sort of threw caution to the wind, came up with this design, and I think much to everybody's surprise, they all loved it. They said, yeah, that seems like an appropriate solution. And we sort of said it has a base, a middle, and a top, and that about did the trick. So here you see some of the development of the facade just in a plain drawing, elevation drawing, and then the pieces, basically the facets that make up this geometry. And as you pull these pieces apart, so once I think the story here is too when this rendering was shown to the mayor, and I think this was a meeting that actually went on where I wasn't there. But because we were expecting that they'd say like, you have to tweak it again, and they all said, yeah, looks great. And then the challenge was, since we're talking about making, it's like, how do you make it?
Yeah, we had no idea. We just sold it to the Sportis Institute and the city, and because we thought for sure everything would be rejected, and that it didn't have red brick and wrought iron. And we got the approval, and we said, oh my God, now we're really in trouble, because we had no idea how to put this thing together.
And I think in that sense, it's actually interesting, the crown fountain that we just talked about. I mean, the crown fountain was basically a series of failures, sort of planned failures in terms of mocking up and trying and sort of finding out through that. And it turned out that was not very much different from here. A little more traditional as a curtain wall, but it had a lot to do with basically testing in real time. And so some of just the fundamental issue was when you have a geometry that zigzags in plan and also leans both ways in section. If you just took regular curtain wall and tried to stack it up, it doesn't work. Those mullions are always going to misalign. So sort of the breakthrough here was, and this was in very close collaboration with curtain wall engineers, we developed this mullion that's an aluminum extrusion, one piece that the alignment is always exactly the same, you can lean in and out, but that radiused front of the mullion basically allows all the various geometric alignments. So you can see here how it basically can, that same mullion through the very simple, all you do is you change out this one piece here. You have to have a bunch of those to allow for all the angles, but everything else is totally is the same. So that was part of the way to make it work, but also make it affordable. And ultimately, the outcome of all of that is this faceted glass geometry that you've probably seen. It's also the whole idea of, I think when we decided to go all glass, We were always amazed by the view. This is actually one of the few buildings in the South Michigan Avenue stretch where the public can go up, and then you look back over Grand Park and Lake Michigan. So that was always a big part of the idea. And then some construction photographs. This is, you know, when you do stuff like that, it's a little harder to see if the contractor is on track or not. There were some scary moments, but the other amazing thing is this highly articulated system actually went together incredibly well, much better. This is a very interesting lesson. This went together way better than like an acoustical 2x2 scale tile, which has been done for decades, and you just pick it out of the catalog. But there was actually this sort of a care of the engineering that went into this, made this go together real well, and the ceilings looked, you know, like they were misaligned, you had to almost fight as hard for them. And again, so this incredible view out over the park and the lake. Including the people that end up cleaning glass. This is typically like a bosun's chair, and they rappel down from the top and then basically clean. And then just some impressions of the final product. And again, I think what we try to achieve, in addition to giving an expression to Spurs is a Jewish institution, they always, you know, they said, gives a building that represents us, that explain that has an appropriate expression of the Jewish experience. And so that had a lot to do with folding and the facade. Basically, almost any time you ever take a picture, it will look a little different based on the daylight conditions, the weather conditions, and all of that. But this moment here, right over the entrance, is one that I like very much because I think it summarizes this idea of using the materials of your time and really pushing them very hard. So we are very attracted to glass because within, you know, a quarter inch or with an insulated unit within an inch or an inch and a half, you get incredible performance. You can do almost whatever you want it to do. And at the same time, you can express that thinness. So it also has something to do with economy of resources, I think. And in that sense, that's a little bit of our answer to the Sullivan building, that we basically did it out of glass, what he did out of stone. And impressions of the building with its context. There's also, other than the facade, there was like a 10-story atrium, an atrium that went from the very top to the bottom, with a skylight that basically drives daylight into the building. So there's a 400+ person auditorium on the second floor. And then some interior impressions. The interior was kept very neutral, shall I say, in terms of, because light had a lot to do with this idea of making an appropriate expression for this Jewish building. And so the entrance sequence, open grand stairs, so to speak, that takes you out to the auditorium. This building itself. And then as you come up this is the 9th floor and the 10th above, you can actually sort of see where the daylight comes in with the skylight above. And so these are the 2 floors or the 3 floors where really this daylight sort of washes in. You get some sort of layered planes of glass. And then looking back, this is looking back towards the Michigan Avenue and the lake. Spurs had always, even the building they were in before was like a layer cake, which is the most typical building, which is floor after floor. But because Spurs is this multi-cultural institution, where they have, there's a college in there, a museum, a library, and a lecture hall, they said, we really want this energy that is Spurs, we want it to be felt, we want there to be connection. So that drove a lot about these kind of openings in the floors so that you really, no matter where you go, you be aware of the other activities in the building as well. Then again, the exterior. I call this the skirt. So it's sort of like a canopy where the glass folds out. Gives you an opportunity to open and close the umbrella or just a sense of arrival. And then here, you know, sometimes the building looks like that. I mean, depending on the sky, it becomes very reflective of it and takes on a very special characteristic. I think this is it for broad context.
So the last project we'll talk about is a federal office building in Miramar, Florida. This is just about 20 miles north of Miami. So this was a GSA Design Excellence project. We had never really done any government work because we could never understand the forms that you had to fill out to submit because it was all Greek to us. But after going through a project that I think Tom had shown us, the Eisenhower Memorial, we started to understand a little bit more, so we went after this and we'll show you some of the design elements that we presented. So here we started to understand, again, I'd spent some time in Miami, but we're really not familiar with it, so we like to look at it from a standpoint of, you know, what are the conditions? And so the project site is right at the eastern border of the Everglades, which is one of the more phenomenal environments in the world, uniquely only in Florida. So we started looking at it, and again, this is the site it was an improved site. But what we found very quickly in this is actually that entire area was Everglades just 100 years ago. So that opened our eyes to it because that entire area that the site exists now had been improved, which meant it wiped out the Everglades. So we started to look at this particular site, and we always wondered, they sell this as 20 acres of improved land. And you know, what was there before? So this became sort of a design element. Actually, the most important design element was what is the land? What's the land want to be? Well, the land wants to be what it's been for 10 million years. It wants to be Everglades. It doesn't want to be 24 inches of pea gravel. That's actually not at all. So our idea was really what should the land be and what should the building be. To go back, however, we looked at it, and in 1962, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan actually started Design Excellence. And it's a fairly easily comprehensible document where it says that the architecture is to reflect the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of the American national government. Okay? That it is to embody the finest of contemporary architectural thought, qualities that reflect the regional architectural traditions. In this case, it looked to be Taco Bell because there was a lot of red tile roofs and bad leaky dry conditions. And that an official style must be avoided. These are all in the government documents. And this is incredible that the federal government actually writes something like this, that the design must flow from the architectural profession to the government and not the other way around. We thought that. So we actually harvested all of this as ammunition for how we would approach the design. And the development of the building site is actually the first step in the design process. So these are some of the things. And actually, there's great examples of that. The Chicago Federal Center is one of the first examples of design excellence in 1964, and also art and architecture with the Calder piece there. Incredible. There's also really bad examples of federal architecture. This is a project we actually went after. They loved 40,000 square foot floors where you were about 100 feet from a black tinted window. So sort of a disaster. They also got real efficient. Let's just make them as big as we can, and we'll crowd a lot of people in it, and it'll be a
great place to work. You can see real sensitivity to site and building. So not great. So our approach to the site was to look at it, and this is actually our submission to. So we have a federal office building. In this case, it was about 400,000 square feet. This is parking. There's security requirements, very large security requirements, a secure perimeter. So this is sort of the diagram of how, and then this idea of restored wetlands, and then even in fact a nature preserve. So these were our diagrams that we had for how we would approach the site without knowing too much about the site or the program. And also our methodology for effective environmental design. This, I think, if we actually have this as in our kitchen right now, and we're reminded of it every day because it's the simplest things that are sometimes the hardest to actually hold on to. And this is really kindergarten in some ways. Architecture is actually the #1 thing. The siting, massing, and orientation that's really the first thing any architect should pay attention to. Then start paying attention to the enclosure, roof and walls and what have you. HVAC lighting controls to make those work. And then ultimately the fourth one is alternate energy, PV, solar cells, what have you. Turns out that you can see the life cycle in the inverted white triangle. Life cycle of massing is 100 to 500 years, where alternate energy, putting windmills on buildings, is like a 5-year. And it's exactly opposite for the cost and maintenance of operation. So this is this really very simple sort of two triangles brought together as really a clue to how you have to think about it. You don't missite your building and then hope to make it up with wind power. That's not a good approach. Site your building correctly, give it a great enclosure, and you're more than halfway there. So, and again, another thing is to be flexible and adaptable to the changing marketplace. So we did these ideas about, here's a typical, where you have a core and a program, and we said, well, if you take that and put the cores to the perimeter, you have then a more flexible program area. You have north, south, east, west. You orient it to the axis, the long axis on the east-west side. So your solar radiation is blocked on the east-west side, and the sun is high in the sky on the south side. Also, it's very good with bomb blast, which is it's the reality of working with the federal government on buildings like this, that bomb blast is a big issue. So you have to make that part of the design process. The issue with this, however, is it's an enormous floor plate. In our case, we wanted to have a floor of maybe 60 to 80 feet wide because of just the efficiency of it. Again, you can create courtyards. And then we take a section through this and look at it in section. Start to think about the building. Again, this is not programmed, but it's sort of an approach to design. Secure perimeter, where you can do it with either a big fence or a moat, or you can actually take the existing landscape, which is actually Everglades, and actually make the secure perimeter Everglades, which is what it wants to be. So we said, that's a much more secure area and much more beautiful to look at. We can, again, with bomb blast, we can shape the building. We can screen it. We can screen it also for bomb blast and for sun. We had some experience with that. View out is still really important. So these are these simple, almost kindergarten sketches about how you approach a design. The end, a courtyard. This idea of how you can bring light into a building and have it, in this case, very light. But you still have South Florida sun conditions. But you can use the building actually to shape it and mitigate the sun. So here the sun's not a problem because of how that works. We had experience with that in a project. So we were just taking sort of our palette of materials and thinking, these could all be used and adapted to this design.
diffuse light, also attention to the movement of air, so you can have openings, courtyards that allow the breathing of those courtyards to happen. And then a really important part is the comfort, this idea that if any of you have been to Florida, it seems to be particularly an epicenter of walking in and being frozen and blind simultaneously, right? Because the temperature drops 20 degrees and the foot candles go from 10,000 to 35 and you're blind. So we said, no, the process of designing a building is designing the process of entering it. So here you can see the upper left, temperature of 90 degrees, 10,000 foot candles. So by creating just a little bit of an enclosed area, covered outdoor area, you can drop the temperature by 2 degrees and cut the foot candles in half to 5,000. You can then have a semi-outdoor covered area that would drop it another couple of degrees and drop the foot candles from even 5,000 to 1,000. Semi-outdoor control, which means through ventilation, some movement of air. You can drop it even further. Again, sort of a controlled area for an atrium courtyard. And then finally, entering the building at 75 degrees and 35 foot candles. So there's this process that as you go through and into the building, there's a conditioning of every member that enters the building through this journey. This is what we were pledging if we were selected for the design. And then finally, this whole assembly of building also had one other ingredient, which is sort of undefined. It's hard to sort of nail it, what it means, but the building had to be iconic. So what is an iconic federal building? We don't know. We know the Capitol is an example of an icon, but that's the thing that was required here. So we started with the 3 bars, just as a starting point on the land. This idea that we wanted the landscape to go through and move through the 3 bars. Ultimately, though, the 3 bars were 400 feet long, so it's actually, because of the program, ends up being quite a... So what we did is shape them, and simply it's almost like taking a street and just gently curving it. It's really no different than that. So you actually created a bit of place as you experience the building, and then we ran the landscape through. So this is the final site plan. Again, sort of secure perimeter through landscaping rather than fences and anti-ram devices. Very, very welcoming and opening.
And just as you're here, if you remember the diagram, you said we're going to basically sort of cut the office building into bars that are 60 feet wide. So basically those 2 main bars are just that, they're very narrow. And to me, this is actually a bit of a, in a way, we're really singing the government's praises in this case when they have through a program like this. The sad reality is when you practice outside, particularly in a city like Chicago, all these developers, they know exactly what the footprint is that yields the greatest profit. And so it's a box that's 120 feet wide by whatever, fits the right amount of elevators. And so here, to me, what's really, I've thrilled on some level, mostly because we were able to take the regular office box, sort of slice it in half and pull that apart. And the thing is that it's not necessarily new in the world. I mean, there's other places where stuff like this has been done, but I think here, hopefully, projects like this are really important, and the government's taking the lead of actually allowing this to happen. Simply because with a 60-foot bar, you're getting a lot more daylight for all the people that work there. It's as simple as that. And it strikes me as, in the debate about what's right architecture and what should we do, a lot of these things are not, this is not brain surgery. If you want to make people more productive, happier workers, all of that, it's a pretty simple architectural answer. But the fact that we were able to build it here, I think, is a big deal. And also, when we walk the site, all of a sudden you realize, if you zoom in a little, it's like the biodiversity that's already there, even with the gravel right next to it. So that was amazing. It's sort of, you just look around and see what you haven't built on it. And this is a bit of the analogy. If you have a building that's 120 foot wide, this is the typical size. You get a certain amount of daylight distribution. Whereas with 60-foot bars, you basically have just that. You get significantly better illumination from both sides. And then not only that, but you also, the view out. This had a lot to do with the full height glazing. So, looking at the sky is nice, but in this case, the Everglades that we wanted to bring back are actually, there's some really beautiful to look at. And so this gives you an idea that on any of these floors, particularly the lower ones, you now are physically, and you're looking this way, and you're physically connected with nature, which I think is also an important thing to a meaningful thing. And Mark, this was about the...
Yeah, this is, in the case of glass, glass is not a great insulator, but when we only have a theta of 20 degrees, 95 to 75, it actually is wonderful. It really works. In Chicago, a little tougher, but in Florida, we have that difference. It actually works quite wonderful. The challenge happens on the east and west sides, where the sun is low in the sky, and South Florida is brutal. So you have here morning and afternoon suns, even though they're small sides of the building. So what we ended up doing is just putting all our exit stairs on those ends. So you can see, we use the exit stairs as sort of the insulated bottle, if you will. It ends up being about a 12-foot space, that if those stairs, which are still communication stairs, have a different temperature of 10 degrees, it's such a transition space, that's not a problem. Ends up being sort of a buffer zone. So again, in the summer, it's the spring and fall that becomes a problem here. So we ended up developing these sunshades, and the glass composition, which is sort of very much a hybrid, we ended up putting a perforated screen on it. We ended up putting ceramic frit, a low-E coating, and then finally this RF IR shield, which is radio frequency infrared shield that's required on these high security buildings. So we have that.
So here we are after 30 years of doing glass buildings. And we sort of thought, well, I think somebody asked, I think one of the owner's reps probably, said, so what's the spec of the glass? And we said, well, we don't know yet. And they said, what do you mean? So you've done this forever. Well, the answer to that question is sort of illustrated here. When you saw that diagram that Mark showed with all these layers, and we basically had to fight and sort of talk over and over how we needed to do a mock-up. So if you remember, Crown Found was basically built by mock-ups. That was one of the key lessons, so we were not going to let this go. And we said, let's do a mock-up, but let's even take these glass and put it on a trailer. So that trailer can actually be driven around on the site, and you can east facing, south, west, so you get a true representation of what it's going to look like. And this is just, I don't know how many we ended up making, but 13 of them on the trailer. And just being different manufacturers, you put the low-E coating on the number 2 surface and the 3. All these, so it gets infinitely complex very quickly. And you get a sense of, even with this projector, which is pretty good, but the difference in appearance is unbelievable. I mean, from this green, peppermint green to a blue one. And this was, I don't know if the next photograph shows all the people that, there's a whole project management story where it literally was like a fight of the project to get this mock approved. And as soon as we actually did it, all these managers came out to like, oh wow, that's pretty wild. It's really different glass. And then, when it's all said and done, it was this obvious. But so the long story short is we think we know glass, and to some extent we do, but on some other level we really don't. And if you ever do a project out of glass or out of any material, you should never trust what you think it is, or if you have a sample in your studio, or take it outside, do it bigger, and you will be surprised what you learn and how different it can be.
So South Florida, again, because of the low sun, even in an October day where it can be 80 degrees, and that sun entering the building as well as glare entering the building was a big issue. So we developed this solar shade, this is a fairly advanced wall system called a unitized wall, and and we basically developed this perforated shade system, is these almost chevrons, because we love the idea that we were using the least amount of material to actually mimic the tracing of the sun. The sun starts low, goes high, and comes back down again. We actually found doing the same thing with the solar shades rather than the typical horizontal was actually very appropriate. We could get more protection from that early sun, that early morning and late afternoon sun by doing that. You can see these are some images. And then here's an example of a little animation we did, December 20th. So if you look on the floor, you can see as this runs, you can see sort of the dappled light. It goes 10, 11, 12. So you can see it's sort of changing and dappling on the floor. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. So that's all right, actually, December 20th, because I can have a little bit, because December 20th, even in Miami, it can drop. So I can have a little bit. The problem month actually is like those October, March, where the sun is still lower in the sky, but now I can have 80 degrees. So again, if you look at this, just watch how little dappled light happens on the floor. So this again is taking away the direct solar. In this case, it was a high security law enforcement group who was occupying the building. They hated the idea of the shades. They just thought, they wanted to see out and they didn't want it. But it turns out that the shades are this beautiful foreground element, and the background with Everglades and the rest of the natural setting is actually even better. So there's almost a frame of reference, and rather than just a purely transparent. So it actually works out, quite nice. So these are just the final renderings of the piece. And it's sort of amazing because we were given this project. We had never worked for the federal government. It was about a $150 million project. We competed against Helmut Jahn, Tom Pfeiffer, Foster, a couple of other, and ended up winning. And so that's the amazing thing, we actually can. So, and we also, it's amazing, we convinced them to build this with these images of sort of the building, this sort of white building, if you will. Now again, these are renderings, so these are big ass lies, we think, because these things we have no idea whether it's actually going to, because you have to sell it like this. But sort of the amazing thing, again, this is our building in the Everglades. But this is actually under construction. It's going to be finished in September. And these are the actual, you can see the site with the buildings in the Everglades already starting to form. That's the south. That's not a rendering. That's the real thing. So the attention to detail. That's the same side. What's amazing is same building, same, but just a little bit different condition. And it shocked me. I immediately sent this to Ron and Thomas. You guys won't believe it. This building's white, which is amazing because that's, of course, what we sold the government. These are the solar shades, which you can start to see form this beautiful pattern, almost a chainmail type pattern on the facade, and really work quite beautifully as in performance. So that's sort of the building. So I'll end with just these last two. This is what we found as architects. And so we said, instead of always thinking, as we do, we immediately run to sort of the building and the object and what have you, but if you in fact think a little bit higher as the very first picture of what it could be, we found this was the site that we found, and this is how we're leaving it. So I think that's the real duty of an architect, not to think about just the immediate enclosure, what have you, but really think about the totality of how you impact the entire environment. And in our case, we said the most important facade of this entire project is this facade here. Thank you.
Talk about how Miramar is so far from mass transit and the middle of nowhere, and there isn't really any way to get around mass transit. Is that something that you really believe?
Yeah, One of the things, because of the security setback condition, the government, before we were ever involved in it, purchased the property in this case. Trying to convince the government to actually do like a car sharing, carpooling, busing, what have you. No, as much as we kept trying to get them to do it. The project actually is scheduled to be net zero by 2030. Whether that happens is whether the government does some investment with PD. But it is all the infrastructure is in. The issue of the 1,000 cars that are allowed to park, there's a 1,000-car parking garage. We kept fighting that and fighting it, but it was something that we simply couldn't do.
So for such a small office, it seems like a project like this and Spartus is going to involve teams of the people that make those. I mean, like, are you bringing in experts on every project separately? Do you have kind of these different offices you're always teaming with? Just kind of.
Yeah, in the case of the Spurs Institute and especially this, we worked with a great group out of New York called Atelier 10. I don't know if any of you know them. We actually met them when we redid Crown Hall. Donna Robertson had a great idea to just bring in these European environmental engineers. And Tom and I just said, oh my God, what a disaster that's going to be.
Well, you said that.
I really stress the Europeans. And it turned out to be, they were incredible. We now work with them on every job. Their group in both San Francisco, but especially in New York, have been sort of fundamental to our understanding. So the shades are just an example of how we work, and they model things and they work with us. And because I think the notion of performance and beauty actually go hand in hand. That's the great thing we're always looking for. We're always looking for what nature does, seemingly without any effort. However, evolution was not an effortless process. Evolution forced the environment to be so efficient, but it's so beautiful because it's efficient. And I think that's what we're looking for as architects, to be as efficient and as beautiful as nature is. So I think finding out about how sun and light and air enters and exits a building is really important. So we work with, in this case, we work with a great mechanical engineer also out of New York, Flack and Kurtz, that, again, top people.
And I think that's, just to add to this, that the amazing thing is if you work with the best people you can find, it's so much more fun. I mean, the amount of stuff we learn, and we might have some preconceptions or ideas, but we get real challenge in sort of the best way possible. So, because we've always been a small firm and still are, and this is, from a business perspective, this is actually part of our model. The beauty of us versus, let's say, Skidmore is that we can, on every job, we can sort of look around and we have a sense of who is at the top, and we then work with people that have proven themselves, of course, but we can also always pull in the best talent, just like we do when we hire. So the people in our office, we've gotten a comment quite a bit. I mean, I've heard this at conventions and so forth when we present it and say there are 50 people, and they say, what? I don't believe it. And it's true because you can, if you work with the right people, it's amazing what you can do. And we sort of, that's, I think that's one of the most thrilling things, because if you every day go to work, you have very smart people around you, and it's a lot of fun. And so we do that both internally and very specifically, sort of handpick the smartest people we can find as consultants.
Yes.
What other projects are you working on that will be interesting going forward?
We're working on, we just were selected by the State Department to do embassy work, design excellence embassy work. So this last project convinced them that we could do a highly secure building with finesse and grace and beautiful materiality. So it doesn't look, it's a bomb blast building. And you think of bomb blast as, you know, tough, but this one is light. So we're doing an embassy in Papua New Guinea, which is as far away from Chicago as you could possibly be. It's our first assignment. And then we're also, another interesting thing, we teamed, and Tom's leading there, we're redoing the United Terminal at LAX. It's a $500 million project that we're the design lead on. Because United, what we're finding is that actually not having experience, now I'm old enough and I've got so little hair left, that when I say, I don't really know that, wow, that guy's really smart when he says he doesn't know, which I say routinely. And what we found in the case of the State Department, they had a big competition, and the group, they selected a team of architects. We had no State Department work, and that actually ended up being an asset for us because they didn't want the same thing. In the case of United Airlines didn't want architects that had done airports because they saw these airports being done the same. So we always said, Ron and I, and now Tom, we always said, we've done one of everything. You know, we've done one factory, we've done one office building, so now we've got airports and an embassy going on. So those, but they're long projects. You know, these projects are 5 years long. So,
Yeah, something like United is a little hard because they're so corporate. It's a little hard to predict whether it's going to be super publishable or just. But you know, because I can't help myself because I'm also a teacher and there's a lot of students in here. I think the reason what you're all doing is actually can be just beyond thrilling because on that project, as Mark said, it's enormous and cost-wise, the complexity and all that. But so Mark and I were just there. When you end up in a room full of people, these meetings are crazy. There's like 40 people, but you show up. You are the architect. And as much as everybody says, like, well, you have to collaborate, of course that's true. And of course you have to be flexible in this, that first and foremost, we are architects. And to me, there's like this just happens. So we show up at a meeting like that, and our job is to remind people of the value of space and bringing in daylight. And you can just imagine how complex this is. And then, you know, initially, especially, all these corporate people are like, I don't know if I know how to do it, but that's our job. And I feel that's something that, again, you know, there's so much talk about what we ought to be and how we all change the world, and I'm all for it. Of course, we have to do that. But I happen to believe that what you learn here, there's some fundamentals to it that you bring. That is, nobody else says that. If it's not the architect who makes that pitch, nobody else will. I can guarantee you that. So for me, these are the most amazing moments where you are in these meetings and you get up, and you're the architect, and you tell them what you think, and you remind them of some of the things that matter most. And so there is in my mind, in practicing architecture and learning architecture and teaching it, there's a bit of a hierarchy of some of the things that matter most. And
yeah, and I think, Tom, we literally just came back and, you know, there's a finance person there. That finance person is not going to think nor care about, like, why can't it be as exhilarating as what that little boy in the fountain felt? Why can't walking through, 10 million people go through the United Terminal every year. So our obligation is how do you affect 10 million people? And so we're still reminded by, you know, that little boy, why can't it be like that? You know, why can't it be as enjoyable and as visceral as that? Why can't it have an integrity and a simplicity and sort of an authenticity to it and not all polluted with noise and visual pollution? Why can't it have a serenity to it? So this is what we keep, you know, keep reminding, in this case, United. Now, we're skating on thin ice, we've almost been fired a couple of times. So in order to hold those higher values, but I would say, unless, and it goes back to Tom, unless we bring that No one else will ever bring it. The builders can figure a way to take everything and make it cheaper and less credible. They are experts at doing that. And we kept saying, guys, this is going to be here for the next 25 years. Let's make sure it's done credibly with a degree of authenticity and a degree of detail, connection, and materiality. And that's what we keep fighting. It's an interesting process because it's something that we're starting to lose in this particular project. You know, it's $500 million. This is where you start to lose. You feel that, wow, we're losing control. As much as control we had in that very first steel and glass house where every bolt was like where we wanted to put it, here we're trying to get like the entire ceiling. And some guys said, I can do it cheaper if we did it on a cardboard. You know, and everyone says, really? How much cheaper? I'm like, you know, these are the people that if the Louisiana Purchase, we just came back and we were saying, if the Louisiana Purchase came to them, they'd say, $6 million, way too much. Why would we go with it? It's just a bunch of swampland there. So I think we have to sort of see past it, see what it could be, and I'd say that's the greatest thing. There's a lot of trials and tribulations to being an architect, but on the best level, we see and make the future. I mean, and I think that is the amazing thing. We have to see it, we have to believe in it, and then we have to make it. And we can't compromise, we can't let the idea slip away because of the practicality of making it. And that's why we call this the art of making, because we actually do believe that the whole design process starts from that very first scribble and doesn't end until you walk that final space. Everything you do to a project affects the design.
That was great. Let's have some grace with these guys.